Hello and welcome to this lecture on stream ecology. This is an overview of a larger course which deals with the ecology of streams that was begun in the summer of 2020 but was modified because of COVID-19. So initially I had planned this course to be a prep to go and do a lot of field work. Unfortunately, that will not be the case for this course. However, as a result of that, I'm going to increase the sort of the quality and quantity of material found within the lecture to compensate for the fact that we won't actually be in the streams. Streams are a fascinating part of the biosphere, not only because of the fact that we depend on them for a number of different reasons, but because they are ubiquitous. They're important for both humans and animals. They are pleasing in a number of ways, not least of which we enjoy spending time near them. But they also cause us enormous amounts of headaches. Things like flooding, biting flies are often commonly associated with things like streams. So before we get deep into various components of stream ecology, what we're going to start out with is a very brief overview of stream ecology in general. So as I generally do when I do lectures, I provide a guide early in the talk, and then I encourage students or people that are spending time in it to come back to the guide later and review the material and make sure that the material that I have identified as important in the lecture is identified and understood by the student later in the lecture. One thing that's important to grasp about stream ecology is while we think of streams as something of a static thing, this is a picture in exactly the same spot of a stream just a few months apart, and you can see that the stream is wildly different even between different times of the year. So streams are very hyper variable. Even in the context of something like the biota, things within it have to change over the course of a year, and the appearance and shape and structure of that stream also change through the course of a year. We have a number of things to talk about in the stream ecology course, not least of which there's a lot of lingo, sort of the language that goes with discussion of this. I anticipate that you'll get involved in that early and that you'll learn it quickly so that you can spend time learning about the fun sciencey bits of it. The language is important to master so that we can do more complicated stuff quickly. So one thing that people often ask when they want to study a topic is why did this thing, whatever it is, matter? Streams, as I've already alluded to, matter for a variety of reasons, not least of which in that they provide access for resource extraction, so people use them for fishing. We use them for water. We use them to transport all kinds of wastes away. They're important for beautification. We enjoy spending time around them. They're important for maintaining and structuring the landscapes that we live in. And we'll get through a lot of these different components as we move through the lectures. And by the end of the lecture, I anticipate that you'll be able to articulate a lot of the reasons why streams are important, although you may actually not be able to articulate all of them. And of course, these are different in different communities. Some people value streams for some reasons, and other people value them for different reasons. And sometimes those reasons are conflicting. So as a general rule, here are some highlights for why streams are important to us. Pollution removal, fishing, they're a water source, we use them to camp around. Travel and transport has been really important for humans in the past. This is still very important for a number of different places, but less so for some developed nations, but still very, very important. Swimming and bathing, of course, and also if you're in a country in an underdeveloped country, then you may also use them as a place to do washing, so very important for things like the maintenance and control of cleanliness. Resource extraction, so you can think of the regular things that you might pull out of a stream, a fish, you might think to yourself, but also think of all the minerals we extract from streams. Certainly things like the gold rush were possible because of streams. They provide enormous amounts of habitat, both for animals in the water itself, but also for animals around the water, right? These are really important for structuring things like forests and the animals that depend on water sources within them. They're very important for erosion. They're constantly eroding material. You may think of erosion as a bad word in many cases, but erosion is very important for controlling the shape and function of landscapes. They're also important aesthetically. We like to just look at them and have them around. And we also use them for indices, which we'll get to later in the course, in ways in which we sort of grade the systems that we are living in. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. I don't want you to think that this is the only possible thing that streams can be useful for, although this is a range of different things. But streams are useful for all of these things, and these were the big ones that came to my mind when I sat and thought about it for a while. But you could certainly think of other ways in which streams are useful. Now we have a course here that is titled Stream Ecology. And so before we get too far into it, I want to remind you what the word ecology means. It comes from oikos, which is house, and ology here, which is the study of, so the study of homes. And really, ecology gives rise to a simpler spelling, right? So we just drop the O off the front and we eventually get to just ecology. And what it really means when we say the study of homes is we're studying how the environment and organisms influence each other. So how both the organism creates that home and how that home feeds back on the organism and creates the organism. So you can think of something like this. Water is constantly moving. That is something that organisms are going to have to deal with, that this water is always moving downhill in streams. But simultaneously, organisms may modify the water to flow in different directions. They may modify it to reduce the speed. They may modify it to flow or to be pooled in areas so it doesn't actually flow or flows very, very slowly, or that it uses different paths if it has to seep out of that pool instead of flowing away. So there's a lot of ways in which the two are interrelated. We are both a product of our environment, and we produce the environment that we exist in. And this is true of organisms all over the world. And this is why we do this thing called the study of ecology. One of the other really important elements of streams is their food webs. Not least of which, when I think of streams, I think of extracting things like fish from them. But in fact, the food webs are really important for a variety of reasons. We often associate streams with fish, and that is fine, that fish are very large and noticeable. And we often think of them as very simple, and that is also fine at times, but I just want you to appreciate that we're going to spend some time really studying food webs and streams because it's such an integral part of stream ecology. And that just because we can make simple diagrams like you see here doesn't mean that they are the way that food operates in streams. It doesn't mean that it's not a useful practice, but it doesn't make them right either. So in most cases, we think of some sort of plant material or what we call detritus, which is a bunch of brown stuff at the bottom of streams, producing bugs. These bugs either get eaten by other bugs or they get eaten directly by fish, and then we think of ourselves as removing those fish. And that's fine. Again, this is actually true in a sense. Bugs are eaten by fish, and fish do depend on the bugs, and the bugs do eat the algae and the detritus in the stream. But there's also a lot of complexity. And this is a good example of how the complexity of streams will change, hopefully, as you take this course. You should appreciate that there are simple views of streams. These are important to understand and develop a framework around. But as we get into streams themselves, we'll find that complexity is extremely high in almost anything we talk about, in part because streams are so variable. If you think about the difference in streams in just a place like the state of Maryland where we are right now, there are lots of different streams. There are streams that are in mountains. There are streams that are down by the ocean. There are streams that run through cities. There are streams that run through farm fields. There are streams that run through newly emerged forest. There's streams that run through grassland. There's streams that are partially submerged underground for part of their time and then reemerge and become surface waters again. So there's lots of different streams, and if you look at that broadly around the world, there's a huge range of streams. There's streams that flow in and around saline bodies. There are streams that flow in deserts. There are streams in polar areas. There are streams that are in tropical areas. There are streams that are in areas with very hard bedrock. There are streams in areas with soft sandy substrate that never stays the same. There are streams that have huge numbers of different organisms in it. There are streams with very few organisms in it. There are streams that only flow for part of the year, right? And so the nature of streams is highly variable. And so as we begin to think about streams, I want you to appreciate that what we're going to talk about are simple views of them, and that's important, again, to understand how streams are actually functioning, but that there's a lot of variability, and there's a lot to be learned at looking at different areas of streams. So for instance, here's a slightly more complex example of a food web. This food web has got some more sophistication in it. It doesn't just talk about bugs now, right? It's included some other things in it, like a duck here and some variety of different fish. It also introduces different kinds of primary producers. It's trying to incorporate things like bacteria and fungi. It's also trying to incorporate Homo sapiens, and it's bringing all of these together and showing you a slightly more complex picture, although it itself is still relatively simple, right? It goes from one step to another. If you get into even more complex scenarios, right, we can think of this as a stream food web. There's different kinds of algae. Maybe there's different kinds of plant matter. There's not just bugs at the bottom, right? There's all sorts of things doing different things, and we'll get to these as we get to different major groups that live within streams. For the moment, you can see that there's all sorts of cool stuff like smaller fish and larger fish. Some fish eat algae, some fish eat other fish, some fish are specialists on inverts. Some fish can switch back and forth. There are inverts that do all these things as well, and they're even more diverse, right? So this is even a more complex scenario. So stream ecology, the other thing I want you to keep in mind too, is that we often think about this as just the water inside that we look at when we go out to a stream, sort of inside the stream channel. And we may even be sophisticated enough to say, well, remember the stream channel. The stream goes up and down, so the water specifically here moves around a little bit. So we have to think a little broadly about what we mean by in the water. But actually, of course, streams are interconnected with the systems in which they exist in, right? So this is a great example. Spiders are actually really important in stream ecology. They have incredible impacts on the kinds of animals that live in the stream, in part because they eat such huge numbers of emerging insects. And those emerging insects, because they get eaten, do not go back to produce more insects in the stream. Right, so spiders have important impacts. That means that spiders near streams can be largely supported by the animals in a stream. If spiders are largely supported by animals in a stream, then there may in fact be things like lizards or amphibians or birds that are very dependent on organisms within a stream, and yet they travel long distances away from that stream. There are bats that are specialized to feed on fishes that are near the surface of the water, right? So they're entirely dependent on the stream food web. In addition to that, so we're thinking about extracting resources out of the stream, think about resources that fall into the stream. If you ever go to a pool and you look in, you'll see that there are lots of terrestrial insects floating around in that pool, right? Hence the reason we have things like skimmers and the reason that we pay people to go around in the morning before pools open to skim off all the floating dead bugs. So think about all those terrestrial insects, and that happens in streams all the time. There's tons of terrestrial insects that fall into streams. So the stream is not so much separate from the terrestrial landscape as a component of the terrestrial landscape, but it is very, very different than some of the world in which these animals live most of the time. So being a terrestrial insect in a stream is not a great idea, and being an aquatic insect out in a terrestrial environment can be very risky. There's lots of risks that come with that. And of course, the importance of understanding the feedback of these systems, right? If there are lots of terrestrial insects falling into the river, there can be lots of big fish, right? And that can change. In some cases, large fish actually modify things like the shape and flow of rivers, or the way in which the kinds of trees and material that surrounds a river dump leaves into it. If you have a very heavily forested region, not only are you going to get huge amounts of leaf litter, which is going to break down and produce huge amounts of silt in the river, but you're also going to shade and prevent algae from growing in that river. So again, the terrestrial and the stream system are very much intimately related, and we're going to see that as we move forward in the course. But I don't want you to look at a stream and say, this bit of water is different than all the things around it. I want you to think of it as, this bit of water which I'm studying has some interesting properties, but it is highly integrated into the system. And this is going to be an issue for us as we try to exploit streams for a variety of reasons, because if we exploit them in a way that stresses them beyond their limits, we may lose or create feedback cycles that alter or change these systems such that they're not useful to us anymore. The other thing to keep in mind here are that streams are vanishingly rare on the surface of the Earth when we look at a percentage of the water. A lot of people like to point out about 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. That's true, about 70% is covered by water. Most of that water, of course, is salt water. The vast majority of it is in fact salt water. There's actually about 2.5% of all the water that's on the surface of the earth is locked up as fresh water. All the rest is salt water. So when people ask you why the oceans are salty, it's probably better to ask why aren't all water bodies salty, right? Because it should be the other way around. Why isn't all water salty? Because the vast majority of it is. And even within that 2.5%, only about 1% of that 2.5% is actually what we call readily available fresh water. What do I mean by that? Again, this is another way to look at it. Well, if you look at that just small amount of fresh water, again, about that 1% of that 2.5%, what you will find is most of it is frozen. The vast majority of it is in fact frozen. Now, this is going to change in a climate change world. The amount of glaciers and ice caps is going to continuously decline. But that water is not going to remain fresh water. By and large, that's going to enter the ocean and just become part of the oceanic water, not become part of the freshwater system. If you then look at, well, what else is out there? Well, a lot of that water that isn't frozen, that is fresh, is groundwater. So you'd actually have to dig into the ground to find it. And the vast majority of water is actually that groundwater. A very, very small amount of that water, maybe 1% of that 1%, is actually surface water. If you start to break down what that surface water is, most of it is ground ice. Okay, so that's actually ice just sitting on the surface or locked away in permafrost. All right, so again, pretty much like groundwater, or that is not what we think of. A lot of it is actually placed inside of lakes. And if we are interested in lakes, there will be a course that should be coming up in the spring of 2021 that will deal with limnology here at St. Mary's. So the most of that water is just sitting in surface water in big lakes, and even then, a lot of that water is actually contained in just a few lakes around the world. There's some that's actually contained as soil moisture, some in swamps. A very small amount, a 0.5% of this 1% of 1%, that is in fact rivers. And what you can see next, the next most abundant thing on this, no, it's not quite in order, but the next most abundant thing is living things. So of the rivers of the world, a tiny little percent of all the water on the surface of the earth is rivers, which in some ways makes sense because water is always running downhill to get to the ocean. And rivers actually make up just about twice as much water as all the living things on the surface of the earth, which is staggering when you think about it. So all the water you see in a stream, right, if we lined up people around it, about half of that water in some ways could be made up by just the people who live in and around that water, which is amazing, right? And the other organisms, I should say, because that includes plants, which are a big component. The rest of the water, the last little bit of water, is contained as atmosphere. Yes, so it is that small, right? So if we look at this another way, take a look here at all the water of the world broken up into tiny little cubes. Look at that biological water, right? That actually takes up, that's a noticeable cube. And when you compare it to river water, those dark blue cubes on the other end, it's not that much different. A lot of the world's biology takes up as much water as a lot of the world's streams. So these are really, really, really rare. And yet they are really important, really, really important. For instance, here's how they can have these sort of profound impacts. This is the Grand Canyon. If you haven't seen it and you have a chance, I would go see it. And the Grand Canyon is a great example of what happens when a river runs in an area for a long, long time. Right? There's not as much land being built up, so it's really easy to see how the erosion is happening. This is the Colorado River running through the Grand Canyon, and this river has been able to carve down over thousands of years through this canyon. That's what makes it so deep. This river is constantly eroding it away. And that is happening everywhere. And it's happening at very high rates in many places. It's just not as obvious until you go to some place where there's a lot less plant growth on the surface and there's a lot less things like soil being added to it. All right, so that's a very brief intro to where we're going to start. So let's get started on the nitty-gritty then of the streams themselves. As I mentioned before, streams come in what we call a stupefying array of diversity. These are just some good examples of different streams. There's one over here in the top left, which is something like a forested headwater stream. The word headwater will make more sense as we move through the course. But this is a classic example of a stream you might see in maybe upstate Maryland as you get into the sort of mountainous regions. The next picture over is oh, I'm highlighting in yellow, which no one can see. This one here is a desert stream. You can see there's a lot less vegetation, but still, again, another running water. Over here, we have these in Maryland as well. This is a grassland stream, often associated near coastal areas, right? So these are saltwater, often saltwater marshy areas. We're going to avoid really touching on saltwater areas as much as we can, but again, these are going to form stream channels. Here's a great example of a stream, what we call blackwater stream. I know it's not truly black, it's actually the color of tea, very dark tea, and that will make sense to you as we get into those kind of environments and talk about why that's the case. We also have these. And then finally down here, again, just some examples down in this picture here. This is a glacial stream. This is a stream that is just appearing right from the bottom of a glacier. You can see it has very unique characteristics, but again, some of the same patterns we see in other locations. These are all very diverse bodies of water, and yet we're going to lump them together, right? So what makes a stream a stream? Well, it's really hard to define in some ways, and that's actually fine, right? What we're really going to say is flowing water is what's going to make a stream, but you're going to have to understand that in some streams, there are large sections that don't flow or maybe even flow backwards at times, okay? So we're going to start in general as we talk about streams with some common basic principles that will be probably applicable to most streams. But I want you to understand that as we get into this, there are going to be exceptions to almost every rule, and that's great. That means there's lots to learn and lots of cool things to study. All right. One of the easiest ways in which we classify streams is by numbers, right? And we call permanent bodies of water that flow year-round that have no other entry points a headwater stream or number one, right? So temporary streams may flow into these what we call first order streams, these number one streams, but they themselves are the only permanent water body that exists at that small size. When two first order streams, number ones, meet, they form a second order stream. When two second order streams meet, they form a third order stream, and so forth and so on, and you can keep going up and up and up in order. This is a very common way to define streams. One thing I want to point out is when a higher order number, for instance like this third order, meets a lower order number, it doesn't change the order below, right? So that's still a third order stream as you move downstream. But when two evenly numbered orders meet, then the following segment is a higher order number. So in this case, 2 plus 2 actually is equal to 3, although 1 plus 1 still equals 2, thankfully. If we break this out by order, and this again, it's roughly related to the size, you can of course expect that there will be tons of first order, number one here, streams, and very common, very easy to find, permanent water bodies that are small and remain wetted year-round. Okay, so tons of those. Those are easy to find. As you move up, you'll see that this declines very, very rapidly, right? It's exponential decay. By the time you get into 10, 11, 12, you're talking about 20 to 30 streams in the world, right? Sometimes these are called rivers or river numbers. The other important element to understand here is first order streams tend to be very short, which makes sense. They're on the order of maybe 1.5 kilometers. Whereas 12th order streams here, the largest, this is actually the Amazon River, are hugely long, enormously long. And that's because to get small, they would have to intersect another 12th order stream, right? So they would only count for the distance over which they're 12th order. But since a 12th order stream is so large, there's absolutely no stream that's going to intersect with it that's as big as itself or larger. And as a result of that, the whole length that it's a 12th order stream will be its length. They're also going to be enormously large, right? and they're going to have, as a result of that, huge amounts of area. I just like to point this out because it's sort of staggering when you think about it. The Amazon River at its greatest width, right, is 3 kilometers long. It would take you minutes at 60 miles an hour to drive across it, right? That's amazing. Compare that here to a first order stream where the width is often in the order of a meter or less. Very small streams. Although the area that these drain from, or the area that these drain in total, right, is actually comparable and is actually greater than in some cases things like the Amazon, right? So first order streams are very abundant. They tend to be relatively small, and yet the total amount of surface area on the earth that they drain is actually larger than the Amazon River. Here's an example of a system. This again is the Amazon basin. In the middle, right here, is that 12th order stream that I was talking about. Right, so that's noticeable. Wow, that's cool. But if you look out here, look at all these fine little tips, right? All these tips out here, these are all first order, all the way around here, maybe even second and third order. And as they combine, they get bigger and bigger and bigger until you get this huge, large stream right in the middle. This shadowed area here, outside of this bright area, is outside of what we call the watershed. Every drop of water that lands in this bright area falls down and travels to the Amazon River before it escapes or it evaporates into the air. Every bit of water that drops elsewhere goes to another river and drains out, right? And if a river does not drain to the ocean, this does occasionally happen, then you will drain to a hypersaline lake. And here again, just to show you some amazing features about the Amazon River, truly a unique river, deserving of its own course even to talk about. But I just want to show you the strength and the power of these systems. Look at how large this delta is, right? This is enormous. This is where all this water is going to dump out. And actually, you can detect and collect Amazon River water many miles out to sea because the Amazon River is so distinct and so large, and it doesn't mix very quickly with the ocean, that you could actually go out into the ocean, put down a cup, and lift out fresh water well away from the mouth of the Amazon because of how much water is flowing out of there. All right. So let's introduce another bit of language here, what we will call the drainage basin. So we've talked about stream order, or you may hear it called river order. The word river and stream here I'm going to use interchangeably. But you'll also hear of this thing called the drainage basin. And the drainage basin is the place where precipitation will run downhill and towards a river and then out and away from that river, okay? The stream inside of a drainage basin is very small relative to the drainage basin itself. A good example in this picture here. Look at this area that's light blue compared to the area that's green or brown. And this river is actually enlarged to show that sort of texture it has, but it itself would be quite a bit smaller. And you can see the same thing if you go to Google Maps and just zoom out above a river. You'll see that the river covers large amounts of area if you get an elevation map, but the actual amount of that river water that's available to be detected is very small. Drainage basins are going to have a huge impact on the way streams function, and we're going to talk about this as we move into how streams are developed, how they interact with the land, how the land interacts with them. But I want you to appreciate and understand this language, this thing called a drainage basin. Again, it's all the downhill area, so if you have a contour map, you can build a drainage basin. One of the things you may also notice in your reading is that the reading points out that the average river length is related very strongly to the mean drainage area, and by a very interesting exponent. By this exponent almost to the 2 power up here, if you'll see. And you may say, oh, why is 2 such an interesting number? Well, think about it this way. If you have a line, let's call that your stream, right? If you have a line and it covers an area, right, then you would make a box. And a box would be related to itself, the area within it, by the value x squared, right? 1 times x squared, because the length of each side would be related to the internal area within that square. And that will be true of streams as well. Streams are very closely related to the area that's within their drainage basins, and almost by that x squared exponent, which is really interesting, right? That they are really forming some very simple geometric patterns on the landscape. Streams are going to have different levels that we're going to learn about. This is what we call the stream hierarchy, or the stream system hierarchy. We've just talked about this, the stream system. Right? We've zoomed way out and talked about something very, very large. But in fact, as you zoom in, you may get into things like segments and reaches, pool, riffles, and microhabitats even. So I want you to be aware that these things exist and that we're going to be talking about them. We're going to be able to identify pool, riffles, and runs. We'll be able to say what a microhabitat is. We'll be able to talk about a reach as we get there. We'll be able to talk about a segment. But often, a lot of our time, we'll be talking about streams, and we'll be talking about reaches or maybe pools and riffles. All right, so again, we like to, when we get into streams, we often deal with these much lower levels, reaches and riffles, but in fact, there's a whole amount of the stream which we don't see when we get into that sort of narrow view of the world, that it's worthwhile remembering that if we zoom out, we can see a lot more. Something I will mention right now for you, because it's such a common terminology and common language, is this thing called a pool, a riffle, and a run. Pool, riffle, run is a series of repeating landscapes that appear within streams. In the case of pools, these are quiet areas. They usually have much lower flow. They often appear at the end of what we call runs. Pools often tend to be very deep. These are the places that students often fall in first because they are slow moving. Students want to get in at that point. But what they don't understand, that pools, because they are slow moving, are also the deepest sections of those rivers. And so they will often step into a pool and then they will be submerged. Where you actually want to get in is this thing called a riffle. A riffle is a faster moving area. Rocks are often exposed. It's often relatively shallow though. It's on the order of centimeters to maybe at most half a meter, which means it can be harder to stand in at times, but it's always very shallow. Riffles, not rifles, notice that there are two F's here, are very high flowing areas. These lead down into what are called runs. Runs are areas with very little turbulent water, but the water is moderately deep and relatively fast. That water will intersect the side of a stream channel and will begin to erode it, and that will create that nice slack water area that is the pool. Organisms are often going to have evolved to live in one of these habitats. Some organisms move between them regularly, but many organisms prefer to stay in one of these habitats. All right, and this repeating riffle run pool, you'll hear me mention over and over again, and it's a very, very common system to see. Occasionally, you'll see people just talk about pools and riffles. That is also common. People will ignore runs. Runs are sometimes not obvious, and they also may disappear in headwater streams, where a lot of people like to work. This is a really great example, or as good example as I could give of it with an image of a pool riffle run. So this person here is standing in right at the edge of what I would call a pool, which is right here. That pool is feeding down into an area that it starts out as a run but becomes a riffle very quickly. There's another, you can see down here, run, and then back over here there would be a pool. Okay, and that repeating habitat will be very useful, in part because there's lots of it, in part because it's spatially separate from itself, so it's not always connected. So organisms that, let's say, live in this pool may not interact very often with organisms that live in this pool because they would have to go through habitat which is not the kind of habitat they live in. But it's also important because it's highly predictable. And when you get highly predictable environments, then you see organisms adapted to take advantage of that because it's a consistent pressure on the landscape that consistently molds and selects for organisms that are able to use it. Another thing we need to talk about is the language associated with streams. And this I'm going to refer to as a stream cross section now. If we cut a stream in half, right, if we look at it from the side and slice into it, there's a lot of language to refer to different things, and we should know it. I've already talked about this one, that the stream channel, which is the max wetted area during regular flooding. The area that is not wet but that may be dry at any one time is called the bar. Here it is down here. The high areas that keep the stream within that channel are called the banks. The bottom of that stream is called the channel bed. So all of this down here is the channel bed. But the area that's actually wetted, we might call the wetted perimeter. Okay. Everything outside of this over here is what we call the floodplain. And this does occasionally get wet, although often rarely. And there's often a nice marker that distinguishes it. There's a rise in the land right between the stream channel and out into the floodplain. And these are called levees. They can be natural. You can also have artificial levees, which do exactly the same thing, which help to maintain the stream within the channel and limit its access to the floodplain. The importance to understand is streams naturally flood and they naturally exit and enter their floodplains at different times of the year. And they also naturally exit and enter their floodplain over long periods of time, right? And so when we think about streams as these consistent bodies of water which don't migrate or move, that's a really artificial and a very colonial European view of streams, that they can be controlled and maintained for the benefit of a society within a very narrow range, and they are not allowed to move outside of that. And that is a really risky way to view streams. Streams are going to be variable. They are going to respond to different things around them. And there are going to be times where we can't control them. One of the most difficult things to warn people about is, although we have a lot of control, when we don't have control, that's actually often when we want the most. And that's when the most damage is going to occur because we can't control them as narrowly as we think we can in many cases. There's a bunch of other things that we might name, and you should probably know these terms as well. Again, the wetted width here. There's a bank full width, which is the amount of width that's taken up when the stream is completely full, when it fills up that full cross-section of the channel. There's the bank height, which is the height between the stream and the top of that levee. There's a bank slope, although I'm not terribly concerned about that you know that. There's this thing called water depth. Right, that's pretty obvious what that is. Water depth is a point at which you measure the water. And often you do this all the way across the stream at many, many different points. So you can estimate what's called the cross-sectional area. And if you know the area that the water is flowing through at any one time, and you can estimate how fast it's flowing through that area, you can estimate the discharge, the amount of water coming out of that stream. The last word on this list I really want you to be aware of is the thalweg. This is a term that's not particularly common or easy to associate with streams because it doesn't come from a simple English word. The thalweg is the deepest point in a flowing channel of a stream, and so it is important and it does occur regularly. You can see it's really located right here in this diagram, and it will be a term that you will see over and over again. Let's zoom out again to sort of stream reaches now, okay? Streams change across their course. The stream that you meet at the mouth of the river, where it intersects with whatever this is, probably ocean, maybe a lake, is very different than the stream that maybe you saw if you were up here. And yet they're one and the same river, right? They interact together. Headwater streams, these streams over here, are often very steep. They often go through land that is very hard to erode. They often have large drops. They tend to be colder. They tend to move quickly. They tend to have riffles and pools, but they tend towards more riffles. They may have some runs, but they certainly do not have a nice meandering line. They're often very steep in that way. As they move down into the what we call this transfer zone, they start to spread out. They start to slow down, although they may still be quite fast. They tend to be larger at this point. More waters are meeting together. They will tend to start to form that Riffle Run pool sequence that we saw before. There is some meandering back and forth, making those nice S waves. As we get down here into what we call the depositional zone, the stream itself really starts to slow down. There's a lot of pools. There may be very few or almost no riffles, in fact. There may be mostly runs and pools. And if you're in a very large, slow-moving body, you'll see almost no riffles, in fact. There is actually some amount of deposition that is occurring. Simultaneously, there's erosion. The stream may branch out and form nice braids, right? It may not even be locked within what we traditionally think of as a single channel. Humans have known many of these features for a long time, and humans have modified many of these features for a long time. Here's an example of a dam placed on a stream, right? And we've been doing this in lots of different ways for a long period of time, and we've done it in different locations. Dams or controls of river water have occurred probably in every continent by every group of people that have ever interacted with waters, at least to some degree. Control and use of water in a very specific way is an important element of human societies. Very important to maintain large agrarian societies. Today we use them to control streams in very large ways, right? Here's a picture of a dam on that Colorado River, right? Here's the Hoover Dam. Huge project, right? Huge modification of stream flow, and yet it behaves or responds to some of the same things and some of the same behaviors that we see in streams elsewhere. This is a number of pressing issues associated with it, not least of which these things like Colorado River are actually drying out. You can see here on this area on the side of the wall here, the stream is actually it's lowered. All that white is actually salt that's left behind as the stream's evaporated since the Hoover Dam has been filled because the amount of water that's traveling downstream is gradually being reduced. And in addition to just the water itself, we use it for power. We use it to provide avenues for transportation. You can see there's a road here that people are driving on. We use it for recreation. So these systems are really highly modified now. But they've always been modified by humans, so we need to keep that in mind. Although the scale and rate is very, very different than it has been in the past. We can also modify little things. Okay, so the human interaction with streams, that typical pattern that we see, can be modified even at a small level. Here's a great example of a farm ditch, right? Here's a stream. This is a small stream. It's going to behave and follow some of the patterns we see in streams elsewhere. You can begin to see that meandering appear, right? That meandering is a natural part of streams. But you can see it's also very, very controlled. The primary goal of this ditch is to move water out and away. It's trying to get water off the landscape. And I wanted to leave you with a few thoughts about if you're really interested in streams and this is something that you plan on doing in the future, then I would encourage you to start to check out books and read about them. Because a stream course is, while very useful, a good prepper, and certainly important in your overall study, is not going to be the only thing that can provide you information about streams. There's lots to talk about and lots to see. And so it's really, really important that if this is something that you're interested in, that you go and seek out more information. And there's lots of good and interesting books to consider when you do that. Notice many of these are very specific to different regions, right? So there's some very, very specific information in these, again, because of how different they are. All right, so that's an intro to streams. And next up, what we're going to do is hydrology and geomorphology, at least our first lecture of it. And a lot of students who are not as interested in sort of physical processes of streams tend to find these to be least interesting. But I want you to understand that without understanding these systems, we can't really understand biology, we can't understand the way that humans need and interact with these systems, and we can't understand and predict how these systems are going to change. So we need to spend time dealing with the hydrology and geomorphology of streams.